I don't remember this, but I probably wrote something when I was 8 or 9. Most people do. And in fact, most people are at their absolute best in the poetry business when they're that age, because they have no preconceptions, i.e. misconceptions about what a poem is. They have no idea of what they're doing, and I mean, in my belief, for that reason alone, have a much stronger chance of actually doing it. And the more circumspect, I mean, circumspection's a great thing, but the more one knows, actually, the more dangerous and difficult it becomes in a strange way. I remember early on, when I was about 12, writing a poem about a fort called Charlemont Fort, near where I was brought up, which had been burned down, in fact, in the 1920s, at the time I was referring to earlier on. And it, I was comparing and contrasting the glories, as it were, of that era and my innocence. It was an Elizabethan star fort, of the kind that they built in Jamestown, for example. And I was astonished when I went to the reconstruction or the reenactment, whatever we call it, of the Jamestown site, to see on the wall a depiction of this very fort, where that was built right where I was brought up. So I was comparing and contrasting the glories of the bygone age with what Yeats would call, I suppose, the filthy modern tide. And I used this phrase at the end of the poem, the reek of gasoline. The reek of gasoline. And the teacher said to me, gasoline? I suppose you mean petrol. Do you mean petrol? So, in other words, one of the other components that I didn't quite get around to mentioning there in terms of the back of the mind, when I was been reared in the 1950s and 60s, was the huge influence of American culture, British culture, of course, but also American culture, television. We watched all the television series, particularly the westerns, of course. We saw all the new American movies. Read all, we'd read the books, of course, reared on those also. And so that gasoline was as likely a component in our speech as petrol. So I started, that was the first poem that I remember writing. I don't have it or anything, but then when I was a teenager, started writing in earnest, as it were, in the way that only, with all the earnestness that only a teenager can muster, when you're 15 or 16, I mean, by heavens, you're a serious, you're a serious person. So, but I was very lucky early on, in that I met a number of people, including first of all, I was encouraged by my teachers. They were quite wonderful in that sense. They really encouraged me, and others, many others, not just me, many others. They encouraged to write and they introduced us to contemporary poetry in classes, for example. And also they introduced us physically to contemporary poets. So that when I was a teenager, I was about 16, in fact it's 1968, it's almost 40 years ago, about 40 years ago almost to the day, I was introduced to Seamus Heaney. And he was very welcoming to me, and funnily enough, I was talking to him yesterday, I think it was, or the day before, and I'd just written a little poem for him. He was given a medal by the Royal Irish Academy, which was founded by a man called Lord Charlemont, which was after whom the fort that I mentioned earlier on was named, so it kind of all comes round in some way. And you know, he was very good to me, and others were very good to me, very encouraging. And apart from that, there was the realization, which I think, I mean, we've heard about it many times, but I think it's really important for how we get to do anything at all. Write poetry, fix cars, you know, get interested in invention and physics or whatever it might be. And it's the idea that I can do that. And I mean, we've heard this 100 times, a million times, but certainly in this case it was true. There was the sense that there were people who were not so unlike ourselves, you know, who came from just up the road, and they were writing poetry. As if writing poetry were a perfectly reasonable thing to be doing. It was not something that one should be ashamed of. It was not something that dead people did exclusively. That actually one could, you know, have a go. And I'm sure that's really important for most writers, was that sense that they got generally from a teacher. I think if you scratch most writers, there's a teacher just under the surface. I.e., that's to say that they will acknowledge some person, probably a teacher, who gave them a blessing of some kind, you know, gave them the go-ahead. I think, again, just the sense that I wouldn't want to say that anybody could do this, but in some sense that, you know, one could do this, that one could write about the bits and pieces of one's life, the fabric of one's life. You know, one might have read Robert Frost's poem after apple picking, say, but in fact, you know, next door to where I was brought up, the field next door was an apple orchard, and one might as easily be writing about that as, you know, have Robert Frost did. And Seamus Heaney, I think, you know, opened. There were others who had been involved in this, predominantly Patrick Kavanagh from a slightly earlier generation, who signalled, I suppose, the fact that one could write about the matter of Ireland, the stuff of what was essentially still a peasant society, a society that had changed very little actually for a long time. For example, when I was a kid, there were a lot of horses about. That was partly because of the petrol or the gasoline rationing during the Second World War, but it was also because there was still simply quite a lot of them about. And it was like looking into, I suppose, you know, now somewhere in Middle Europe, you know, kind of, actually I think they've probably gone beyond that now. There are very few horses staggering about Middle Europe. But anyway, I think that was the main lesson, the lesson that if that one could make poetry out of a life that we might have been led to believe, was too humdrum, ordinary, unpoetic, you know? And that making poetry was for other people, for smart people, for people who had the leisure to do it, for people who were good at a language, rather than just for ordinary people like ourselves, basically.